Gosh, on so many levels, journalism just abandoned its profession um, in so many ways. Just the basic rules of journalism were almost daily violated. The U.S. journalists, they have a mission. They are supposed to inform citizens in a democracy. We have to have the information so we can then make our own decisions and formulate our own opinions based on information. Um, the establishment media not only hid a lot of what was going on in the ground in Gaza, but they followed one side of the story. Even though they called it the Israeli-Hamas war, they never told Hamas's side. We were dependent on Jeremy Scahill to tell, if you will, to tell Hamas's side on the war. It was always translated through a U.S. or an Israeli talking head. They relentlessly followed the Israeli talking heads, their talking points. They repeated. There were. I got to know these Israeli spokespeople. Daniel Hagari was one of them. Over and over again, he would be shown to be a fabricator. His stuff was not legitimate. People on the ground would compare it to what he was telling people after they destroyed Al-Shifa Hospital first in November 2023, and then later in March and April 2024. In both cases, he lied to the journalists and they repeated it. So there's supposed to be some standards in journalism where if you understand that one of your sources is not forthcoming, is not telling you the truth, that he's been written up in the Israeli media, in Haaretz, for example. He and others, another famous fellow was Yossi Landau, who was a member of this very propagandistic organization, Zaka. And the mainstream media never told us who Zaka was. They weren't a humanitarian first responder organization. They were working with Israeli propaganda. So the repetition and the continue to airing the pseudo evidence and videotapes, even one just wacky invented three-dimensional videotape. Do you remember that of there was supposed to be these tunnels, this whole Hamas Pentagon underneath the hospital? Mm-hmm. That was insane. I mean, it was a complete figment of the Israeli imagination, and yet they kept saying, "Oh wow, there's these tunnels, and Hamas has got a Pentagon down there." It's just all, there's just so many details like that to talk about.
Robin, Jen, you had a thought?
No, go ahead.
Robin, it's pretty clear to me that, and this is just from personal experience. I mean, again, you're in New York City. I'm from New Jersey, and we come from a part of the country where Zionism is at its most prominent, quite frankly. And one of the primary reasons that I think that this is the case, especially in places like Manhattan and Brooklyn, is because of the concentration of wealth. I think that there is, without question, a very big economic component that is tied into this, because if anybody has ever encountered the average Israeli, they're not nice people at all. In fact, when they say that they're the chosen people, they truly mean that they are better than you. Period. And when it comes to that sort of disposition, generally speaking, with average people, and you would think, well, I wouldn't want to do business with them. But unfortunately, because of the way the capitalist system operates, even in its late stages here in the United States, I think that's a huge reason why they have as much control as they do. I think if those elements were not involved, I think that things would definitely be a lot different. But I also believe that one of the reasons people have just kept their mouth shut, quite frankly, for as long as they have, although things are now changing with Zoran in the mayor's being in City Hall and in Gracie Mansion, I think that in some ways is starting to make things really change in a substantial way. But even prior to that, it was pretty clear that so many of these people that would like to say something, they just seem to be under the thumb of those that if you said a word, right, there's going to be a lot of economic trouble for you, among other things. Your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, I think you're absolutely right. The Zionist lobby in this country is particularly strong in New York City. I think what Zoran did, though, is really show the fault lines in that community. And that community is not monolithic. And that's what we found. And in fact, the young people, the way they're falling out now with their very low opinions of Israel. Israel is no longer this state that everybody loves. They've completely destroyed that. It's no longer that safe bastion on the hill, that this mythic place that everybody could go and be safe. And Israelis' own policy has made them so unpopular and made their citizens so unsafe. I mean, we have to say this is the consequence of decades now of Israeli pulling further and further to the right, expanding into others' territories, always claiming that there was an outside enemy and that they had to destroy them. This has been going on for years. So um, let's say that the Israeli lobby has been so well funded and so influential. We know about all the primarying of Democratic candidates, Congress. We probably know that 82% of our Congress people have taken money from AIPAC. That's an enormous amount. AIPAC gives to both Republicans and Democrats. Then there's other aspects of the lobby that have to do with public discourse and civil society. So it's not only in journalism; it was in those other realms, but particularly in establishment media, particularly the New York Times. I have devoted an entire chapter to the New York Times and the Israelis' point of view. But Canary Mission, and what we know that Canary Mission has been attacking students and faculty literally for years, and there is a cost to that, as you were saying, Peter. If you were part of a Palestinian solidarity organization, Canary Mission would have you on a poster on their website. They would call your employees and students, particularly Palestinian students in this Palestinian students, but also other students who just, demonstrated against the genocide. They were viciously attacked by Canary Mission. There's another organization called Honest Reporting, and there's another one called Camera. Those two organizations have been putting pressure on the press for years. The New York Times, for example, fired a Palestinian journalist who was a photojournalist. He had worked in Gaza for 4 years, delivering really good, you're on the ground in Gaza when the Israelis are attacking you. It's a dangerous job. And he worked for them for 4 years, documenting what was happening up to October 7th. And they fired him because somebody in Canary Mission said that he posted a Facebook that was about his cousin who was in Palestine, and he thought that the Palestinian resistant movement, and wasn't talking about Hamas. He was talking about things like the Great March of Return, and most of the year 2018. This was nonviolent. They fired him for that type of posting. Meanwhile, one of their bureau chiefs, Jody Ridoran, was, when she first got to Israel, and she admits that I first came here with a Zionist youth group, and I just loved the old city so much. But I tell it from the Israeli point of view. She openly says this kind of thing. And then on her Facebook page, she was talking about after the Israelis, killed Palestinians again in 2021, 2022. She went into Palestine, into Gaza, and she said, well, going through, where people have been killed, they, even though there more Palestinians than Israelis were killed, the Israelis seem kind of more traumatized by it. Palestinians have this martyr syndrome, and Palestinians, they just don't have as big as lives. She actually said this, as big as lives as we do. And when I talked to them, they had a ho-hum attitude toward the death. Ho-hum attitude. She was talking about the death of their relatives after an Israeli attack. They had a ho-hum
I
attitude.
think it goes without saying that if there's one thing that is keeping the Israel lobby, the Zionist movement afloat in the United States, it's the last bastion of what they've got, and that is anti-Muslim bigotry. It's the last thing they've got, and they're going to exploit it for all it's worth. But once that is eventually put to bed, and I do think if Abdul El-Sayed does end up winning the Senate race in Michigan, that's gonna be a very, it's almost like a death blow, especially in a state like Michigan, when you consider that while, Bloomfield, Farmington Hills is not the same as Brooklyn and Miami, it's still a very big Zionist area in the state, in being that Michigan has that. And if they're to lose that, I think that that's going to be a very big blow. And just another example of how they're on borrowed time here in this country. They really are.
Yeah. Yeah, we can measure that. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the latest polls of how people not only are against the war in Iran, but the favorability ratings. The majority of all people, of all youthful people, 18 to 35 in this country, are a majority. That is 51% of Republicans, and then far more of Democrats. And you can't even run for Congress now and be hit with, you take AIPAC money. You won't make it. And in fact, I believe if the Democrats in the next presidential election don't put up an anti-war candidate and finally say that genocide bad, genocide bad, they're not going to win.
No.
So I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, but this heyday of the Israeli lobby is, you're absolutely right, coming to an end. Finally, I've noticed that. Well, I was at a conference in Manhattan, and it was a journalist conference, and my Project Censored colleagues and I were on a panel, and we were talking about Trump's first year in office and how he had done all these authoritarian things and attacked the press and this and that way. He was just really on a roll. He was rolling back, all kinds of civil liberties and journalistic rights. And we didn't even say anything about Trump or Gaza. But the minute we stopped, a person in the audience said, "You're anti-Semitic." And it took me a while to figure out what she was talking about. And Mickey had read out the title of my book, and it was a subtitle: "The U.S. Media Coverage of Israel's Genocide in Gaza." And I tried to tell her, well, there are actually really legal reasons why it's a genocide, and there's something called the Genocide Convention, and there are rules of war, and if you violate those things, there are rules. Which is well after South Africa was pressing its case in the International Court of Justice. She wouldn't have any of it because I said genocide. I wasn't telling the Israeli side of the story. And even AP didn't say, has told its journalists not to use genocide. So I was using a taboo word, indicated that I was then anti-Semitic. And I write it in the acknowledgement on that book and say, this book is trying to go beyond that kind of journalism. Of course, we also know that by 2024 in January for CBS, CNN, and April for the New York Times, that journalists leaked memos that were telling them from the editorial staff at CNN and the New York Times what could be said and what could not be said. And what could not be said, of course, was genocide, but also for the New York Times, a whole list of humanitarian international law principles, words in which we talk about war crimes, such as disproportionate violence, so refugee camp, ethnic cleansing, occupation. None of those could be said. And they also said, well, the Palestinians are really using our platforms, and so we can't use emotionally laden words like massacre, because we don't want Hamas to use that. Oh, and so just keep in mind that by the in the first 25 days of the war, 5,000 Palestinians had been killed, and they used massacre 53 or 55 times, talking about Israeli people who were killed, and they talked about Palestinian in a massacre one time. Palestinians got one time.
Well, because Palestinians die. Palestinians just die. They just do. We don't know why. They just die. Israelis get murdered and attacked. Palestinians just die.
It's brutal. It's slaughter. But Palestinians just die. We don't know where the explosions came from. Oh, no, we don't know where the explosions came from. Because that was the directive from the Israelis and CNN. Yeah. They put all of their script, all of their copy through the Jerusalem Bureau. You couldn't say Israel bombed. No, and what was the death count? So you've got these Palestinian death counts, which are abstracted numbers. Those aren't really people. They're
I multiply by 10.
Right, and you have to multiply by 10. You know doggone well that there's more than 72,000.
I multiply by 10, and I think that's probably a lot closer.